If someone told you that one of the most praised qualities as a person can have is also one of the quieter drivers of anxiety, burnout, and resentment, you might not believe them. But that is what the research on perfectionism and people pleasing keeps finding. The harder you try to be flawless and the more you bend yourself to keep everybody around you happy, the higher the cost to your own mental health. In this episode of The Talk Room, I'm going to unpack exactly how that happens and give you 10 evidence based practices you can actually try to break some of these patterns. But first, let me introduce the person sitting across from me, Ian Stockbridge. He is a senior accredited member of the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society. Get that right, Wendy. And the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services. A very warm welcome to you, Ian.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you as always. And for anybody new to the talk room, Wendy Castellino is an accredited CBT psychotherapist and EMDR therapist in independent practice with more than 35 years of experience in the field of mental health and well-being, which means that she has watched these patterns play out in clinical settings across decades of different people's lives. Today's episode is about perfectionism and people pleasing, two habits that society tends to reward and that quietly exact a very real price. So, Wendy, let's start with the basics. These two things are often talked about separately, but you tend to see them travel together in your practice. So why is that?
Yes, good question, Ian. So they really do travel together. And once you've seen why, you therefore can't unsee it. So perfectionism is that inner voice that says nothing is ever quite good enough, that your worth as a person is tied to the quality of your results. People pleasing is its closest companion, the habit of putting other people's needs, moods, or approvals so far ahead of your own that you just lose track of actually what you want or feel. So the reason they travel together is that they both are, at their core, driven by exactly the same underlying fear. The fear that if you fall short, whether in your work or in somebody else's eyes, you won't be safe. The perfectionist who can't bear to let anyone down becomes the person who says yes to everything. The people pleaser who's terrified of disappointing others simply becomes obsessed with doing everything flawlessly so nobody has a reason to be upset with them. They feed each other. And what makes them particularly hard to spot and then to challenge is that on the surface, both of these practices look like virtues: diligence, kindness, reliability, generosity. People are often praised for these things. And at work, they're often the ones who get promoted. In families, they're often the person everyone leans on. So the feedback to these behaviors tends to be really powerful. And because the behavior keeps getting rewarded, it makes it harder for you to question whether you should do anything about it.
Yeah, really interesting. And that dynamic of external reward masking internal cost is something that certainly we at Hope and I see in clients a great deal. People often arrive not with a sense of perfectionism being the problem. They arrive burnt out, they arrive anxious, they describe a kind of low level resentment that they can't quite locate. The presenting issue is rarely labelled. So how does it actually show up? What are the real effects on someone who is living in that way, Wendy?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Ian. Yes, very good. I would say there are distinct ways it can damage our mental health. And I think it helps to hear them described concretely because people often recognize themselves in one of two of these examples immediately. So the first and the most probably most common is that sense of a chronic anxiety, long-term anxiety, and that feeling of burnout. When your standard for what counts as acceptable, if you set it impossibly high, you can never fully relax into a job well done. Every task becomes a threat. It could go wrong. It might not be good enough. Someone might notice a flaw. And that constant vigilance in the background keeps your nervous system's stress response activated at a low level almost all of the time. And then over months and years, that is a really well researched route into what anxiety and burnout looks like. So the second is what I would call the achievement roller coaster, where your sense of self-worth rises and falls entirely with your own output. So for a perfectionist person, a good result doesn't feel like joy. It just usually feels like a relief, like you've narrowly avoided something bad. A mistake, by contrast, doesn't just feel like a setback. It feels like confirmation that you're absolutely fundamentally not good enough. This roller coaster is strongly associated with low mood and depression because your sense of value depends on something that is never ever fully within your control. And then the third effect that often surprises people is procrastination and decision making paralysis. Now, that sounds counterintuitive. Surely a perfectionist does everything immediately and thoroughly. But then again, if a task has to be done perfectly, starting it can become really frightening. So, what do? You delay. And then what happens? The guilt and the self criticism have delayed fuels of more anxiety, which makes it even harder to start then. So it becomes like a vicious circle. And then for people pleasers specifically, there's what happens, it's like a loss of identity and the very slow accumulation of resentment. When you have spent years, sometimes decades, automatically prioritizing everyone else's preferences over your own, you can genuinely you lose touch with what you want or what you feel. And many people in this pattern describe a quiet build-up of resentment that they find difficult to name because they've been so conditioned to see caring for others as the right thing to do. And finally, there's the impact on boundaries and coping. People pleasers often agree to things that drain them because saying no has become to feel unsafe. We'll come to why that is in a moment. Over time, that pattern of chronic overcommitment and self-neglect is closely linked to persistent stress. And then some people manage that pressure through less helpful strategies. So, for example, comfort eating, drinking, or social withdrawal, or simply pushing themselves through until something physical breaks.
That picture of reward and punishment, the person who gets praised at the performance review whilst quietly disintegrating is what I think many people will really recognize. Strikes me clinically is that the people most affected are often the last to connect their exhaustion or their anxiety to those patterns specifically at all. So let's go one level deeper. The research on where these behaviors come from is quite clear thing. So just help us to understand that a little bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this isn't random at all. So, what the research, the cognitive behavioral and also attachment theory research shows consistently that both perfectionism and people pleasing are learned, what they call adaptations. They're things that we've learned in order to feel safe, particularly in a childhood environment. So they're not really character flaws. They might feel like them, but they're at one point in their life, a person it would be an intelligent response to the conditions around us, especially growing up. For example, with perfectionism, the most replicated finding in the research is what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And what this means, it means the experience of growing up, feeling that love, approval, or even safety was conditional on achievement. So, for example, if a parent is only warm when the person feels tied to having high grades, feels tied to a high performance, to how well you behave, the child's mind therefore draws to a very logical conclusion. My worth is conditional on these high achievements. And so they chase flawlessly in a way of feeling safe and feeling valued. And that isn't a personality defect. This is simply a child doing the only thing they felt was available to them at that time to feel loved and valued. So, really, it's what I would call a strong modeling effect. So, children who are raised by perfectionist parents, they simply absorb the same standards simply by watching, observing them. And if a parent constantly criticizes their own mistakes out loud or even casually, the child therefore hears that message and internalizes that message and learns that, oh, mistakes, oh, they're dangerous. So, this idea of social learning theory shows this sort of process. But also, high oppression environments outside the home also play a role. So, schools that are very competitive, or if you get into real high elite sports, or even environments which have really high achievement focus. And even then, you end up in workplaces that only reward exceptional results. And these reinforce the equation. The equation is self-worth equals output. And then there's one pattern I also think is really important to name this one, which is perfectionism as a form of control. So in homes that actually were the opposite, were chaotic or unpredictable, or maybe a parent had some form of addiction, or maybe had mood that wasn't very stable, very volatile, or if the person actually felt that their home was generally unsafe. The other way of dealing with it is a child might develop perfectionism, just a way of creating a small amount of predictability. So the learning could be if I do everything exactly right, then perhaps things will be okay. It becomes a way of managing an unmanageable environment.
And that's a really important clinical distinction between perfectionism as an approval seeking strategy and perfectionism as a genuine safety mechanism in an unpredictable environment. In the first case, the core belief is about worth. I need to be flawless to be loved. And in the second, it's more about control. If I get everything right, perhaps this situation won't spiral. And those are different anxiety structures and they respond to different therapeutic approaches, don't they? And people pleasing, help us just to understand a little bit about what does the research say about the origins of that?
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of research around it, Ian, and there's one concept which comes from the work around Peter Walker from people with traumatic experiences. It's called the fawn response, FAWN, fawn. So most people know fight, flight, and freeze responses to threats. Walker contributed what was to name a fourth, this fawn. So fawning means appeasing. Children who could not escape or fight back against a critical or an unsafe or unpredictable caregiver learn instead to scan for that person's moods, to anticipate their needs, to prioritize them before their own. And in most cases, it worked in the sense that it did reduce the immediate threat. And therefore, again, it becomes deeply wired, most often carrying through into adult relationships and workplaces. So, related to that is the research on emotionally immature or narcissistic parents, where the child effectively becomes an emotional caretaker, learning that their own needs are secondary or simply unsafe to express. These children often grow into adults who find it genuinely difficult to identify what they need or want in any given situation because that capacity was never properly developed. Insecure attachments. So, especially the theory around anxious attachment mapped out by Bowlby and Ainsworth. This is also very closely linked. So the child whose attachment is anxious learns that closeness and safety depend on accommodating the parent or the caregiver. So as adults, they often fear that asserting their own needs will therefore trigger some terrible feeling of rejection or abandonment, which is too frightening for them to consider. And it's worth naming something that sits outside family dynamics, which is the role of gender and cultural socialization. So, research consistently shows that girls and women face social conditioning that rewards accommodation and penalizes assertiveness. That socialization can reinforce people pleasing independent of family patterns, and it intersects with them in a complex way. It's not exclusive to women, but the cultural reinforcement is particularly strong with women. That's the difference there, Ian.
It's really interesting, Wendy. Thank you for that. So these are patterns with really genuine roots in family systems, in survival responses, in the wider culture. And I think naming them, that is just really quite important clinically, because one of the most damaging aspects of both perfectionism and people pleasing is the self-criticism that surrounds them. People often tell themselves they simply need more willpower, or that they're weak for not being able to say no. And the research is very clear from what you say that it isn't a character issue. Move onto what can actually help. And I know you have various specific evidence-based techniques for us. Can we just take a moment to mention that if this is resonating and that people feel it might benefit from, that they might benefit from talking through these patterns with a therapist? I know that you and the team here at Hope offer free consultations. There's no commitment. It's simply an opportunity to have a consultation, just to a conversation, just to understand whether talking through these things may be helpful. So, Wendy, what does therapy and what does the research actually offer in terms of practical help?
There's lots of different strategies, and I've just chosen a summary of some that come from a blend of cognitive behavior therapy, often called CBT for short, acceptance and commitment therapy, called ACT for short, mindfulness-based approaches, and compassion focused therapy, that's often called CFT for short. You don't need to be in therapy to try them. These are simple starting points, things to try and experiment with, try to explain them as I go along. So the first one is starting with a CBT approach. So CBT often talks about habitual thinking, and one habitual thinking in perfectionism is all or nothing thinking. The black and white conviction that if something isn't perfect, it's a failure. So, one practical thing you can do is to write down this thought. This isn't good enough, I've failed. Okay. And then start to look for practical evidence for and against this, evidence that it's failed, but evidence that it hasn't failed. And when you actually start to really look at this in a very sort of factual way, you actually find a lot of grey things that were perhaps partly good, efforts that counted, outcomes that were fine. So the thought, therefore, gets re-evaluated, and the evidence helps to challenge this sort of very rigid thought that it has to be perfect. It's a grey in everything. And another one that I really like from CBT is a good enough behavioral experiment. So behavioral experiment means actually doing something. It means a behavior, trying a new behavior. So the idea is to deliberately do one task just to a good enough standard, not your usual perfect standard, and just observe what happens. So a reply from an email that takes 5 minutes to write instead of 50 minutes. A piece of work submitted when it's ready rather than polished for another hour. So what you notice in most cases that the predicted disaster, that things go wrong and terrible, can get told off, thought I'm a failure, the world doesn't end. Colleagues don't even notice. And that experience of the not catastrophizing that it hasn't happened is really can help you therapeutically. So for people pleasers, CBT offers the idea of setting boundaries as something you can learn. So an example could be just learning to say no. This is something you can practice just like any other skill. So the way I would describe it is to actually find ways to say no in small places where there is low risk. Somebody asks you to go for lunch with them, and you might say, sorry, I can't make it this time. To do a really long apology or explanation that most people pleasers feel compelled to do. Keep repeating the word no. Stepping stone for someone who finds a direct no impossible to is an example could be you can't say no, but let me check my diary and come back to you. So it actually gives you space to actually decide what you want and maybe think of a response than rather responding automatically. And I think that works really well, finding ways of saying no.
Yeah, so I think that stepping stone idea is one that I found when I'm working with clients genuinely useful, genuinely helpful to people. Because for someone who's spent years and years in automatic yes mode, even a brief pause is a really significant intervention. Strategies you're going to describe operates on a slightly different level, don't they? Changing the thought and more about changing your relationship with the thought. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Wendy?
And that you've got down to the key distinction between ACT and CBT. So ACT has a different approach. The idea is you don't try to argue yourself out of the thought. You tend to have a different relationship with it. So the first ACT technique I'm going to talk about is called cognitive diffusion. And it's an unusual word. I don't think other people know it. I think it's a bit like a diffusion, where if you think of, say, a tablet diffusing in water, it loses its power. It diffuses as it becomes one. It's a bit like diffusion in that way. You notice a thought without buying into the thought. So when you say to yourself, I have to get this exactly right, arrives, you instead practice saying, I am having the thought that I have to get this right. Now, that tiny little shift from I have to get it right to I'm having the thought to get it right just creates a tiny little gap between you and the thought. So it can help to reduce the grip this thought has on your behavior. And you're not trying to argue it, whether it's true or not. You're just trying to notice that you're having a thought. And the second ACT approach is to really get very clear on your values rather than your approval rating. So this is really good for people pleasers because often instead of will this make them happy or is this perfect enough, you ask, Does this action reflect what is important to me? What is my value? So, for example, if you develop a value, which is a good one to develop in therapy, that taking care of your own well-being is important, that might help you to set a boundary about submitting work, perhaps that isn't perfect because you've actually spent a little bit more time looking after yourself rather than polishing this sort of perfect document. So you start to notice different behaviors because your value is that your well-being is important. You have to keep telling yourself that, reminding yourself that. And another really good one, I think, from ACT is this idea, which is quite unusual, is to make room for feelings which aren't actually a little bit difficult, really, rather than trying to get rid of them as well. So, an example could be sometimes if you're changing your behavior, you might run the risk of disappointing someone or even submit the threat of submitting something which might not be 110 million% imperfect. It can create a genuine discomfort in your body. And this is because it's a learned response that you've done for years and years away, and you have to change how you feel with it. So ACT encourages, okay, you've changed your behavior. It's okay to feel the discomfort. Just be there, notice it, allow it, and just to notice it actually will pass. It will actually go. You don't need to control it. You don't need to prevent it. You just need to notice it's there, and then eventually that will go.
And what always strikes me about the ACT work is that it doesn't require the client to believe the thought is wrong. It just changes the client's stance or relationship towards it, which is often far more achievable, especially when the perfectionist patterns are really deeply entrenched. The self-compassion strategies feel related to that as well, changing the relationship with internal experiences rather than trying to eliminate the difficult feelings altogether. Fit in. What do they add that maybe the CBT and the ACT work doesn't completely address?
Yeah, very good question, Ian. I understand where you're coming from. And I think mindfulness is the next one I'm going to talk about that I think are particularly relevant. So the first is the mindfulness pause before you agree to do something. An example could be people don't need to notice this, but you might be able to just take 3 really slow, gentle breaths and ask yourself the question, what do I actually want here before answering? That simple, tiny little difference can make a big difference. So someone, for example, who spent years giving the automatic yes before they've even thought about it, that pause is generally disruptive to the pattern of behavior. And the second I would say is working with rumination, the perfectionist tendency to replay a mistake for hours and hours or even days. So, what mindfulness practice can add is it trains your ability to notice that I am ruminating again. And when you notice it, you can just very gently and kindly bring your attention back to something in the present moment rather than being pulled into this spiral of deep self critical thinking. It doesn't stop the loop appearing, but it can change how much you get pulled into it. And then compassion focused therapy offers 2 specific practices as examples. The first is the self compassion break. So you place a hand on your chest when you're feeling hard on yourself and say, for example, either silently or loud, this is difficult for me right now. I'm struggling with this. Everybody struggles with this. May I simply be kind to myself? That's simple. That is not empty comfort. It's specifically designed to activate our soothing system, which helps us to challenge the self critical threat response that we normally have in these situations. And the second technique is called the compassionate letter. And there are many letters you can write, but one you can try is to write yourself about the mistake or situation you're dreading, and write it from the perspective of your compassionate self, which is wise, is most understanding. But the process of writing, trying to have that inner voice, that compassionate inner voice, telling you that it wasn't your fault, that you did your best, it's in itself is a very powerful therapeutic message.
And those techniques make sense. They make sense at a theoretical level, but I think one of the most effective things in clinical work is when someone can see themselves in a concrete example. It moves the conversation from abstract levels of insight to something that feels just more applicable to their actual situation. Willing to walk us through one or two cases, obviously keeping things completely anonymous, but just things that might just illustrate what these patterns look like and how therapy can actually shift things.
Yes, I need to say these are just bits taken from various people I've worked with. They're not real individual story, obviously, but they are examples of how I've worked with people. So the first is a man, I'm going to call him Andrew. It's not his real name. A business owner with very high standards, someone who generally does exceptional work. And of course, his clients, his customers value him for that. The problem was the cost of this exceptional work. So he worked every evening, every weekend. He rarely took any leave. By the time he came to therapy, he hadn't had a real break in years. And his relationship with his family was beginning to fracture under the strain. So his perfectionism meant he found it almost impossible to delegate. He had a team, but he couldn't tolerate the gap between their personal standards than his own. So he ended up doing everything himself. So the work involved various kind of process, but some examples were a genuine examination of what actually good enough looks like from his meaning, not to retreat to being mediocre, but actually discussing where the standards actually needed to be exceptional in his work and where they simply didn't. And secondly, working on his ability to delegate, not just the tasks, but allowing his team to do things differently, not better or worse, just simply differently, and tolerating that anxiety game for him, but it did mean that it gave him some more space to work in a more practical way. And I'd say the third thing is actually being very clear about those boundaries when there was an exceptional time from his family, his children, or his partner, to make sure he was there for those as well. So Christmas or birthdays. It doesn't sound much, but got him to change his behaviors and really value these precious times are important. Example, again, I'll call this a female called Jane. She was a very high level professional in her career. She was the primary carer for two children. She built a successful career. Her husband was supportive of her, but she was the primary breadwinner. So there's a lot of responsibility around that. And she'd reached a point where she felt she was failing everyone. She felt she was failing her boss, her children, her husband, and herself. So she came to therapy with a particular belief. If she said no to a line manager, she'd be sacked. And that belief was controlling her behavior completely. So one thing we did, and I mentioned this in the examples, is to really examine that belief, really go into it, look at the evidence. Were other people sacked for these sort of things? How likely is her work to be sacked? Because we're talking about people with very high standards. So actually producing something that looks slightly lower standards is actually a normal standard. Looking at the relationship she had with the manager, was any feedback that he wanted to give her the sack? Feedback at all? Okay. And then alongside that, we worked on improving her communication and her assertiveness skills. Because there's a difference between intellectually knowing that you can say no. What sometimes therapy does is develop the skill to be able to say no. asserted her boundaries better. She's more able to say no. She's more able to ask for things. So her people pleasing skills became less and less, and her assertiveness skills became more and more. So, for example, her husband, therefore, he became more involved in the childcare as she was able to assert her needs better. And it was like an unspoken communication between them. So the communication became more direct and more overt. Therefore, he understood her situation better. Gradually, she was able to get that balance from being a people pleaser up here and assertiveness, and it more went like that.
So both of those cases point to something I think is really important and often very much underestimated, which is when these patterns shift, the change isn't contained to the individual. The system around them starts to respond, sometimes positively, sometimes with a degree of resistance, because the people around them have also accommodated to that pattern. So in Jane's case, her husband's greater involvement in childcare wasn't him suddenly becoming a different person. It was the relationship starting to recalibrate once the communication between people started to change. And that's one of the reasons these patterns often benefit from the relational work, not just individual work. It's not just a self-help problem. So perfectionism and people-pleasing, two patterns that get described, as you've already said, Wendy, as virtues that are rewarded and reinforced across our lifetimes, and that can quietly and steadily erode our mental health, our well-being, when they go completely unchecked. So what Wendy has given us today, the research on where they come from and the 10 strategies drawn from CBT, from ACT, from mindfulness, from CFT, compassion focused therapy, is a genuinely evidence-based way of starting. So if this has resonated, the single most useful thing that you can take from today is probably this. Which one of those strategies could you try? Maybe just once this week, maybe just in a small way, not a program, not a commitment, just one thing, just once. And that's usually where change starts, with the small rather than the huge. And if what we've described today sounds like something you benefit from exploring with a qualified therapist, someone who can work through these patterns with you directly, the team here at Hope Therapy and Counselling, we offer a free 15-minute consultation. There's no commitment. It's not a sales call. There's absolutely no pressure. Simply a conversation to understand what you're dealing with and whether we might be able to help. You can book that via the link in the show notes. And Wendy, you as well, you help people find out more about this type of work. You work with people in this way on a very regular basis. So maybe just tell people a little bit about you and how they can get hold of you.
Yes, certainly book a free consultation with me through wendycastina.com is the name of my website. That'll be in the show notes, with individuals who either have a lot of trauma in their life or have a lot of stress in their life as well, stress, anxiety or depression, or sometimes a combination. And this can come from a background of childhood learning experiences. That's absolutely fine. Or wherever it comes from, we can work with it. That's the main thing. Specialize more in sort of relationships, couples or family relationships. So that's for you. Yeah, please get in contact with me if you want any more information.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for listening to the talk room. It was useful. Please do subscribe wherever you're listening. It makes a real difference to us, and share it with anyone you think might need to hear it. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thank you. If someone